Hi, today we're going to be looking at unemployment, what counts as unemployment, and who qualifies to be considered as unemployed, as well as the different types of unemployment that are out there. And finally, we'll look at how to calculate the unemployment rate using actual data. So before we get started in our conversation, we kind of think about what do we consider to be unemployed in our own minds? What do we think it means to be unemployed? And which of these four people do we think would qualify as unemployed? And we have person A, who's a stay-at-home mom, and person B, who's a full-time student. Person C is an individual looking at jobs, and then person D is retired. And the usual response of many people would be to say that A, B, C, and D are all unemployed because none of them are working. And leaving aside the danger of presuming that a stay-at-home parent is not working, I would say that it's a reasonable assumption to say they're unemployed since they're not working, but it's not accurate given the definition that the government gives us for determining who is employed and unemployed. Based on that definition that the government gives us, and which we'll talk about in just a minute, there's really only one of these people that counts as unemployed. Person A doesn't count as unemployed, B is not unemployed, nor is D, because all three of those people, while they don't work outside of the home, while they don't work to earn a paycheck, the thing they all have in common besides that is that none of them want to work outside of the home for a paycheck. Person A has chosen to stay at home, person B has chosen to focus on schooling, and person D has focused on not working anymore because he's worked his whole life. So those three folks don't want work, are not looking for a job, and therefore they are not considered unemployed. The only person in this group that would be unemployed is the man in person C, who is actually at a job fair trying to find a different job or a new job to move his career. And so when we talk about unemployed people, we're talking about folks who fall into a category known as the labor force. And the labor force consists of a certain group of people. To be considered part of the labor force means that you are 16 years of age or older. It means that you are working or seeking work. So you have to actually be looking for a job. And it doesn't matter whether it's full or part-time. You just need to be looking for a job. And as long as you meet those two criteria and are non-institutionalized or in the military, so you have to be a civilian, then you're considered part of the labor force. And as long as you're part of the labor force, you can fall into the category known as unemployed. If you are not in the labor force, then you are not unemployed, regardless of whether you're working or not. So who's in the labor force? Well, the people in the labor force are those with a job, either full or part-time, so those who are employed, and that's pretty easy for us to understand. If you're working a job, you're employed. And then you have those who are unemployed, and those are the people that do not have a job. They did not work in the last week, but they do want to find a job, and they are looking for one and hoping to find one soon. If you're not employed or unemployed, then you are not part of the labor force. You are considered out of the labor force. And why are people out of the labor force? Well, people are out of the labor force for a variety of reasons. One is that they voluntarily leave. Either they choose to be at home with their children, or maybe they choose to just be at home and let a spouse work instead, or maybe they're retired, they worked a long time and now they don't want to work anymore, or maybe they choose to go to school, or there's lots of reasons why people don't want to work. And if you're not working, you're not in the labor force. Some people, though, would love to work, they've just given up trying to find jobs. And so there are terms for these people. Discouraged workers are a category of people that would love to work. They may have been looking for work for a long time, but at this point they've determined that they're never going to find a job. They've given up all hope and they have quit. And that's what it means to be discouraged. They're not considered unemployed even though they're not working because they're no longer looking. They would love to get a job, and maybe they'll get hope in the future and re-enter the labor force, but for the time being, they don't count as unemployed. They don't count in our unemployment rate calculations or anything. And the other group is what we call marginally attached. These are people, generally seasonal workers, who are not looking for work for a period of time, but when the time is right, they'll come back into the marketplace and look for a job. So maybe like a mall Santa, somebody who's in need, whose skills are in demand from about November until December. But other than that, there's only so much room for a mall Santa in his skill set. So during the spring and summer, they're not looking for work, so they're not unemployed. But once we get back into the right season, they'll start looking for work again. When it comes to employment, one thing to also keep in mind is that just because you have a job doesn't mean you're happy. Just because there are jobs being filled doesn't mean we're doing well as an economy. It depends on the type of job. There are some people that we call underemployed, and those folks are people who have work, but they're working part-time. And they're working part-time in an area that they may not be using their skills to the fullest. Maybe they have a degree in one area, but there's no work in that area for them to do. Maybe they have an art history degree and they'd like to work at a museum, but there's only so many museum jobs. So they end up working as a waiter or a waitress in a restaurant. So technically they are employed, they have a job, but it's not using their skill set in the most efficient way. And so if you have a lot of people who are underemployed, if the jobs you're adding in your economy are constantly part-time work, then it looks good from the standpoint of unemployment. There are people with jobs, but it's not necessarily the best because they're not doing jobs that they want. When it comes to people who are unemployed, there are three categories that you could fall into. One is called frictional unemployment, we have structural, and we have cyclical, and each one of these has its own special set of characteristics. When it comes to frictional unemployment, what we're talking about generally a short-term job loss, people that are jumping from one job to another. The job search is generally quick and leads to a new position. Now, this happens all of the time. People finish college and they start looking for work, or maybe they get tired of working in one job and look for another one, or maybe they have to move. Maybe they're married to somebody who's being transferred to a different city, and so they have to quit their current job, and then they're going to find a new one when they move into the new home. These are people that are frictionally unemployed, and this happens all of the time, which is why our unemployment rate will always be greater than 0%. In fact, we want employment or unemployment to be greater than 0% because it means that people have the freedom and the right to choose what job they want to be a part of. And so if you don't like your job, you should be able to quit. But when you quit, you become frictionally unemployed, and that unemployment rate becomes something greater than 0%. So to the extent that you have personal freedom to decide what jobs you will and won't do, that's a good thing. And as a result, we're going to always have frictional unemployment. We're always going to be above 0%. Another type of unemployment is called structural unemployment. That's the type of unemployment that occurs when there are more workers than jobs available, typically because the market no longer needs those types of workers. It's typically because there's a change in technology or a change in the demand for goods, and so while you had skills that people wanted in the past, they no longer need your skills in the future. So an example might be somebody who was a VCR repairman. So before there were DVDs, or Blu-ray discs, we had tapes that you would record on, and those would often break. And so maybe you had the skill to fix those machines, but nobody owns those machines anymore. And so nobody needs your skills, which means there's no job for you. You are unemployed because the structure of the economy has changed. And while this is miserable for the person who loses their job, it is an indication of a healthy economy. Because when people lose their jobs due to advances in technology, it means that we as a society are moving forward or making progress. Our standard of living is improving. Our quality of life generally is improving. And so while some people are losing jobs, we may be seeing an increase in other new jobs to replace them. So, for example, maybe you're a bank teller, and so we no longer as a society need your skills to make change when people bring in checks and ask for cash, because we have ATMs, and those ATMs are more efficient and more accurate and less expensive for the banks to maintain. So that costs one person their job. The good news, though, is that it's going to create other jobs. Somebody to program the ATM, somebody to install the ATM, somebody to maintain the ATM. And those jobs may even have higher skills, which means they may even have higher wages. So the challenge, of course, is that those that find themselves in a dying industry are responsible for and would need to get more training in a different area, and that transition is difficult. So if you get stuck in structural unemployment, it's unpleasant. But as a greater society, again, it's probably better for us. And so as long as there are advances in technology, we will always have structural unemployment. And given the fact that advances in technology make the world sort of a better, more comfortable place, it's probably a good thing. So we wouldn't want structural unemployment to be 0% because that would mean there was no advances at all. The final form of unemployment is cyclical unemployment, which has to do with the business cycle. The business cycle means the economy is in a phase of growth, and then it goes into recession, and then growth and recession. And so people will sometimes lose their jobs because the economy is weak and people aren't spending. And so while we still need and want their skills, we're just not buying their product currently. And so if you lose your job temporarily, but we still want your skills and we'll hire you back when things get better, you're cyclically unemployed. So maybe you work on a manufacturing line for cars, and during recession people don't buy cars, so we don't need as many car manufacturers, so you lose your job. But then as soon as the economy picks up again and people start buying cars, we're going to need you back on the line to make those cars that people want. So it's not that we lost interest in your skills, we just didn't need you temporarily. In those situations, you're cyclically unemployed. The other thing that we need to look at is how to calculate what's known as the labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate. The labor force participation rate is looking at the overall population of people who are over the age of 16 and who are civilians and who are not institutionalized, and looking at what percentage of that group is either employed or unemployed. What percentage of that overall population is participating in the labor force. And the latest statistics show that about 63% of the overall population of adults 16 or over are participating in the labor force. The vast majority of those folks are employed or have jobs, and a small portion of them are unemployed. But there is 37% of the population that is not participating in the labor force, either because they voluntarily chose to leave or because they're marginally attached, or maybe they're just discouraged. So the way to calculate this number is to take the labor force and divide it by the population 16 or over and multiply by 100. That'll tell us the share of the overall population that is participating in the labor force. So if we take some data, some sample data, we can say that if the civilian population is 250,000 and there is a labor force of 150,000, that the labor force participation rate would be calculated as that 150,000 person labor force divided by the overall population and multiplied by 100. So according to this data, we'd have a 60% labor force participation rate. And when you look at historical data, you see that the labor force participation rate increased significantly during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but has recently begun to diminish. One of the main reasons why is because there are a number of people now that are beginning to leave the labor force. The baby boomers are beginning to retire, and it's driving the participation rate down, among other reasons. The other number we need to know how to calculate is called the unemployment rate, and that's looking at what percentage of the labor force is not working. So we're going to take those who are unemployed, that is those that are looking for work, and see what they represent as a percentage of the overall labor force. The most recent statistics show that the unemployment rate is actually about 3.6%, but we'll round that to 4%. And the way to calculate it is to take the number of unemployed workers and divide it by the labor force, remembering that labor force is made up of those who are employed plus those who are unemployed. So if we have data that looks at those numbers, we would see that if the civilian labor force is 150,000, that it's made up of 125,000 people who are employed, 25,000 people who are unemployed. So to calculate the unemployment rate, we would take the unemployed population, which is 25,000, and divide it by the labor force and multiply by 100. So in this example, we would have an unemployment rate of 16.67%. One thing we notice about the unemployment rate is that the unemployment rate tends to go up during recessions when the economy goes down. And why? Because we always have frictional and structural unemployment, but what we don't always have is cyclical unemployment. And so When the economy goes down, we see a sharp increase in cyclical unemployment, and the unemployment rate rises rapidly. One final thing to keep in mind is that even though unemployment rates are falling, it might actually be a sign that there is not necessarily something good going on. It could be bad. It's possible, because it's a mathematical formula, that people leaving the labor force can actually lower the unemployment rate. So sometimes a falling unemployment rate is hiding the fact that there are people who are becoming discouraged and giving up. And sometimes you see that the rising unemployment rate could be a good sign. It's possible that the unemployment rate is rising because there are more and more people who are no longer discouraged, and because they're no longer discouraged, they're entering into the labor force, and until they find work, we might see that the unemployment rate ticks up. But again, it's not necessarily bad that the unemployment rate went up, because we have more people who have hope. They think the economy is going to get better. So actually, if you look at real data from March 2019 and April 2019, you kind of see this going on, because the unemployment rate dropped from one month to the next, but the number of people employed actually decreased. At the same time, the discouraged workers increased. So while the job situation is fairly good in April, almost historically good, the unemployment rate is dropping in part because people have given up looking for work for some reason. So you have to be careful when you hear about the unemployment rate and whether it's going up or down, and look deeply into the data and determine whether it's going down because more people are becoming employed, or is it because there are people leaving the labor force. We'll do some more practice on calculating unemployment rate and determining what types of unemployment people are facing when we're in class, and I'll see you then.